weekend. Nick, how?
It's 5:05 and welcome into a Friday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. Well, yesterday in Raleigh, it was the North Carolina General Assembly that reconvened for one day to unanimously pass what is known as Senate Bill 743. That piece of legislation is set to provide some $644 million in disaster relief for Hurricane Helene victims in western North Carolina. The package includes $604 million from the state's Saving Reserve, or Rainy Day Fund, as you may have heard it described before, and $40 million from the Office of the State Budget and Management Disaster Relief Fund. This brings the state's total relief package to over $800 million, following an earlier $273 million aid package back a couple of weeks ago. Senate Leader Phil Berger Jr. criticized the state's initial response, but emphasized the legislature's commitment to long-term recovery. And, well, long-term it will be, unfortunately, for folks out west. The largest allocation includes $139 million to the Department of Environmental Quality for infrastructure repairs, $130 million to the Department of Public Safety, $71 million to Health and Human Services, and $65 million to public instruction. We'll get some more details on this with Brianna Kramer, who was at the General Assembly yesterday, coming up for you in about 1 minute. The U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals is set to hear arguments in a lawsuit filed by Republican groups against the North Carolina State Board of Elections. That's coming up for you on Monday. The lawsuit challenges the NCSBE's voter registration process, specifically alleging that some 225,000 voters were registered without proper identification verification, which Republicans claim could allow potential non-citizens to vote. The federal district judge in Richard Myers dismissed part of the case and sent the remaining claims to state court, citing that state law issues should be decided by a state court and not a federal court. Republican groups want the courts to ensure that voter eligibility is confirmed, while Democrats and their affiliated groups argue that the lawsuit attempts to undermine election integrity and could potentially lead to disenfranchisement of voters. Both sides have filed briefs urging the appellate court to either uphold or reverse the ruling from the district court judge in Richard Myers. The lawsuit has become a focal point in the ongoing debate over election security and voter access in North Carolina as early voting continues this morning and as we sit here less than 2 weeks ahead of the general election. It's now 5:08 on the Carolina Journal News Hour. A busy day in Raleigh yesterday as the North Carolina General Assembly was back in session once again to deal with relief from Hurricane Helene. Brianna Kramer from the Carolina Journal joins us this morning. Brianna, you were at the legislature yesterday. Tell us what the latest details are that you're tracking this morning.
Yes. Hi, good morning, Nick. The North Carolina General Assembly reconvened for just one day on Thursday to pass a second disaster relief bill. This one provides over $600 million for victims of Hurricane Helene in western North Carolina. So both the House and the Senate came to Raleigh and they passed Senate Bill 743 unanimously. So that now heads to Governor Roy Cooper's desk for his signature, which is expected to pass and become law. And this is the second round of appropriations. So $604 million will be appropriated from the state's savings reserves. That's the Rainy Day Fund, while an additional $40 million will come from the Office of State Budget and Management Disaster Relief Reserve. So that's going to total around $644 million.
With that number, you just mentioned that you're expecting a signature from Governor Cooper. Earlier in the week on Wednesday, he released his plan on hurricane relief, 99 pages, almost $3.5 billion. Obviously, Brianna, this number is a lot lower. Was there any discussion about Cooper's request list and his proposed budget and how to handle this versus what the General Assembly did when you were up there in Raleigh?
Yeah, not really anything about his specific requests. I mean, this week there's been a lot of criticism directed at him for $175 that is missing in his executive branch. Or they're requesting that much more money out of because of a lack of that money in their budget. So basically, there's been a lot of criticism already pointed at him this week for financial mismanagement and what is going on in under his leadership in the executive branch. So there was just criticism at him, but in terms of what they passed, it has to do, with emergency measures and getting funds that are needed right now. I mean, they're going to be continuing more for, probably years to come, honestly, but
Sure.
This is just what they can do at this moment to help the communities struggling.
Set the sight and scenes for us. Obviously, the headline is the fact that they passed the legislation. Did we hear from lawmakers out of Western North Carolina like we did a couple of weeks ago where they held a press conference before? What was kind of the mood and the attitude from members of the General Assembly, both Republican and Democrat?
Yeah, the mood was a little bit better. I was emotional a few weeks ago. Just such a tragedy out in Western North Carolina. So spirits were a little higher and just motivated to get this done. And so both sides of the aisle came together to do that, although Democrats, of course, didn't align on everything they wanted with their Republican colleagues. But the Republicans in the majority in both chambers said that we need to get this passed and taken care of, and more efforts are on the way. So let's take care of this for now. And that's what they did. So it's going to definitely provide some needed relief, especially in terms of some state agencies like the Department of Environmental Quality. They'll get a lot of funds to help with wastewater infrastructure and the water systems, because we know that's a huge issue, that it's been destroyed out there. And then the Department of Public Safety, they will get $130 million for infrastructure recovery operations. DHHS is going to get some funds, and then the Department of Public Instruction as well, to help with buildings and equipment and technology that was destroyed in schools out there as well. So that's where a lot of the money is headed at this point.
We heard back a couple of weeks ago that the General Assembly said this is going to take multiple rounds of funding. This is round number 2. Did we get any ideas from leadership in either the House or the Senate as to when they will be back? Obviously, probably after the election at this point, Brianna. Is there a plan for a third round of funding, and do we have any dates on the books for that?
So there's no specific plan right now. They are now out of session until after the election. So that was what we got for now. But we know they'll be back in mid-November when they can do even more then. They're back for several days. So, today on Thursday, they pushed everything through in just one day. So it was a time crunch. And so in November, they'll have several days to work maybe across the aisle and negotiate additional measures, but for now it stands as it is in October. And then in the new year, the long session starts, and
Sure.
That's when they will do their new budget for 2025 and beyond. And so that is when they will also, they said that today, will get additional funding in the budget that will be going out to help as well.
You brought up Election Day. There was also some discussion on legislation surrounding early voting, which is typically not something that the General Assembly deals with. That's more of a State Board of Elections operation. What did we learn from that?
Yeah, so the legislature actually passed emergency legislation forcing North Carolina, 13 of the counties out there in Western North Carolina, to open additional early voting sites. And this comes after Democrat-controlled local boards of elections failed to do so despite the strong calls for from voters in these communities. So really, I guess there's been issues in McDowell County and Henderson County along lines. One legislator said that she waited for 40 minutes to find parking to go and vote out there in these counties. And so I guess they're actually struggling with these early voting sites because there's only been one open in one of these counties. And then I think 3 counties as well in Henderson. So the point is that they've been having issues getting these early voting sites to open. But of note is that there was no damage to these early voting sites, and they were operational. So it comes down to a problem with the local board of elections, it sounds like. And so the state legislature said, we are going to get this taken care of, and we're going to make sure that voters have the early voting sites that they need, and not struggling with parking and lines. And so that's what they also did on Thursday.
Brianna Kramer, thanks for the updates this morning. You can read more on both of those stories by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com. It's 5:15, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time to get a look at traffic this morning with Pam Warner.
All right, thanks, Nick.
the number 1 to 44834 to donate now. Thank you.
It's 5:19. Good Friday morning to you. My name is Nick Craig. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. Also streaming live this morning, as we are each and every morning, on our Carolina Journal YouTube channel. The North Carolina GOP-controlled legislature passed an emergency piece of legislation yesterday, Senate Bill 132. That is to mandate additional early voting sites in McDowell and Henderson counties. Those are two counties that are out west geographically here in the state. This action comes after local election boards controlled by Democrats failed to open sufficient sites despite public demand, especially following the devastation from Hurricane Helene. The bill will require one early voting site per 330,000 registered voters in the disaster area, compelling McDowell County to add at least one site and Henderson County to add 3 more additional sites. Henderson County has about 120,000 voters and currently has only one early voting location. Comparatively, Buncombe County, which is a Democrat stronghold, has more early voting sites and better access for its population. Critics, including Republican Representative Jeffrey Balcom, argue that the lack of sufficient early voting locations is suppressing turnout, particularly as the additional sites in Henderson County were undamaged by Hurricane Helene. Efforts from groups like Restoration of America PAC aim to restore voting access in some of those disaster relief areas, emphasizing the importance of a nonpartisan solution. Some local Republicans have also criticized the refusal to reopen and open additional sites, stressing that this failure hampers turnout and creates additional challenges for voters that have been already impacted in some part by the hurricane. The emergency legislation seeks to address these issues, ensuring that voters in Western North Carolina can participate fully in the upcoming election despite ongoing recovery efforts. And with that, we've seen in reports of long lines at early voting locations from the Tennessee border all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. Early voting has been a very popular and hot method to use in this election cycle. We'll get more details with Andy Jackson coming up on that here in just a moment. It's now 5:22 on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Early voting continues across North Carolina this morning as we approach Election Day 2024. And boy, has that been a very popular voting method. Andy Jackson from the John Locke Foundation joins us with new details this morning. Andy, am I reading Carolina elections correctly? More than 2 million people have already voted since the start of early voting just a week and 1 day ago?
Yeah, you're reading that right. We got over 2 million folks on the early voting side that we're actually breaking records pretty much every day. Obviously, we're way behind where we were in 2020 on absentee by mail voting, which makes sense where, the COVID's long behind us. But yeah, it's been a vigorous pace. Folks are voting, especially on the Republican side. We've had an unusually large turnout there. And so those folks are feeling pretty good about that, I would assume.
Yeah, let's take a look at these numbers. These are as of the end of early voting on what would have been Wednesday. And we can see here the numbers are large, but percentage-wise, it's about 34.1% Republican, 34.0% Democrat, and about 31% unaffiliated. Republicans edging out Democrats. Andy, I don't know that that's something that's typical in North Carolina.
It is not typical. In fact, and I've had other people who have kind of been in the game here politically in North Carolina have commented on this. It looks like this is the first time this has ever happened where Republicans actually have more votes, early votes, than Democrats. This has traditionally been a Democratic game where the Democrats come out really strong, especially in the first few days of early voting. Now, there have been individual days where there were more Republicans than Democrats who voted, usually later on in the process when we get closer to Election Day. But this is the first time where the cumulative total of Republican early and absentee votes have outnumbered the Democrats. And so the Republicans did make a concerted effort this year. This whole bank the vote effort that conservative groups and the Republican Party in general have been doing to try to get more Republicans to vote earlier. President Trump, who was really against some of these forms in 2020, has been generally supportive, although sometimes he kind of goes into his old habits on that regard. And so this seems to be paying off for Republicans. Now, the big question is, how much of this is moved voting and how much of this is more voting? The Forrest Gump answer probably is the best. It's a little of both. I've seen other people put out some data. Michael Bitzer, who's a professor from Catawba College, has said that most of these folks are people that have either voted early in previous elections or voted on election day, but there's also a significant portion of those who are first-time voters. So in any case, Republicans are feeling pretty good. And so that's half the equation. But Democrat votes are actually down, or early votes are down compared to early voting 4 years ago. So this looks like there may be a combination of Republicans responding to messaging or being more enthusiastic and a comparative lack of enthusiasm among Democratic voters. And so, if you're a Democrat, you've got to be wondering, why are we about 70,000 votes short from where we were 4 years ago? The electorate's bigger. Now, there are fewer Democrats. There's about several 100,000 Democrats fewer now than there were 4 years ago. But even then, you would try to get these early votes out in order to make sure you have an advantage. Because I don't think anybody believes that there are going to be more Democrats than Republicans voting on election day. So they really need to have this early voting advantage if they're going to win.
Andy, I'm glad you brought up that point about Election Day. Traditionally, that's been a very strong day for Republicans. As you mentioned, this big RNC, this big even NC GOP and Trump himself pushing bank your vote, get out and early. If you listen to any conservative talk radio, most programs are pushing early voting. Let's talk more about that, what I've been calling it and seeing it described as this reallocation of people that were already going to be voting. Unfortunately, Andy, unless you've got your crystal ball working this morning, there's not really a way to know what that number and what the ding could look like for Republicans on Election Day, I guess, until it actually happens.
Well, there is kind of a way to know. Now, I'm not going to run that because, I've got other work I've got to do. I did mention Professor Bitzer's work where he actually looked at the voter history files and basically had a voter by voter comparison of what they did 4 years ago versus what they're doing now. And, most of those voters are voters who have already voted. And there is a small but significant portion of people on the Republican side that never voted, a little bit bigger than on the Democratic side. I think it's, and I'm drawing this from memory here, I think it's about 8% of all Republican voters so far are brand new. Versus, I want to say 5 or 6% of Democrats. So a small difference, but that's going to be important in a state where so many elections in North Carolina are so close. So but how is this going to play out for the rest of the election is the question. Are we really just moving Republican voters from the last week of early voting to the second week of early voting? It's hard to tell still, but that combination of more Republicans plus fewer Democrats is what makes this a little bit trickier for Democrats. So now they really have to hope and pray that those unaffiliated voters who tend to have lower turnout than either Republicans or Democrats are going to break towards Democrats in a big way. And, that's a lot to be hanging on a pretty relatively unreliable group of voters.
We'll continue the conversation with early voting with Andy Jackson after this. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. 528 News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. Friday morning. Let's get a look at the traffic with Pam Warner.
WBT.com for details. Cheers.
5:34. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. You can take the Carolina Journal News Hour on demand on your own time by listening to our podcast. You can find more details at WBT.com or just search for the Carolina Journal News Hour wherever you get your podcasts. Well, it was a busy day in Raleigh yesterday afternoon as the North Carolina General Assembly reconvened for a one-day session where they unanimously passed a new bill that is set to provide $644 million in disaster relief for victims of Hurricane Helene that are still dealing with those impacts out in western North Carolina. The package includes $604 million from the state's Rainy Day Fund and $40 million from the Office of State Budget and Management Disaster Relief Reserve. This brings the state's total relief funding to over $800 million following an earlier $273 million aid package. Senate Leader Phil Berger criticized the state's initial response, but emphasized that the legislature is committed to long-term recovery in western North Carolina. The largest allocations out of this $644 million include $139 million to the Department of Environmental Quality for infrastructure repairs. That, of course, is going to be looking at and dealing with some of the water systems that are really hard hit out in western North Carolina. $130 million for the Department of Public Safety, that's DPS, $71 million to Health and Human Services, and $65 million to Public Instruction. Additionally, $50 million will go to Golden Leaf to support small businesses, and while some lawmakers expressed concerns that more immediate support is needed for small businesses and communities, legislative leaders assured them that further aid will come in the future. And as we head into next year, the long budget session, the state aims to continue working with federal partners to secure additional assistance. So that was the sight and scene in Raleigh yesterday as the General Assembly passed that. It passed both the House and the Senate. It now sits on Governor Roy Cooper's desk where he will hopefully sign that legislation in the coming days. It's now 5:37 on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Continuing our conversation this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour, Andy Jackson with the John Locke Foundation joins us as we discuss early voting, which does continue through next weekend here in the state of North Carolina. Andy, I'm going to pull this chart back up so we can look at all of the early votes that have come in thus far. 31.2% of those early votes are unaffiliated voters, which happen to be our largest voting bloc in the state, yet they're they're at the bottom of the list here in terms of main groups that come out and vote. Who are some of these people, and what do you say with this group? Is this a 50-50 split? Is it 60-40 one way or the other? How do you break this number down?
Yeah, well, they tend to be younger people. There are older folks who have already been registered that switch. We have that periodically, but by and large, these are folks that are newly registered, that their first registration is going to go unaffiliated. They decide they don't really want to be affiliated with either party. They don't like either party, or at least they don't feel attached enough to say that they want to make this their official registration. The other thing is, under North Carolina's system, we have open primaries or semi-open primaries. So there's no real benefit to being registered one way or another, because you can still vote in whichever party's primary you want. They tend to kind of most of them are not really truly independent. You don't have people who are unaffiliated by and large. There are a few who are going to basically evenly split between Republicans and Democrats. Most of them fit into what we call weak partisans. They behave like a Republican or a Democrat most of the time. And that's reflected in how you see voting patterns across the state. So, for example, if you're an unaffiliated voter in, say, Orange County, where Chapel Hill is, you're more likely to vote Democratic. If you're an unaffiliated voter in Gaston County, for example, out near Charlotte, you're more likely to vote Republican. There was some work done back in 2020 that showed that counties with the more unaffiliated voters a county had, they were slightly more likely then to break towards Donald Trump compared towards Joe Biden. But that was a tiny amount. So is basically what you would expect. They're kind of somewhere in between the two parties. Their results that they have for voting is breaking somewhere in between. You would think that with the younger voters that have come in, especially these last few years as unaffiliated, they might break a little bit more towards Democrats this year than they did in 2020. But I really doubt it's going to be enough to make up for this turnout problem that we're having on Democrats. There are still also a few so-called Jesse-crats. They're slowly diminishing over time, where they're registered Democrats that, especially in some of these eastern rural areas, are likely to vote Republican sometimes as much as there are to vote for Democrat, and they just haven't made the switch themselves.
So when we look at this, it's our largest voting bloc, and maybe it's got to do with age and folks not being as tuned in. Why are there not more unaffiliated votes? Why are there more partisan votes, Republican versus Democrat, compared to unaffiliated? Are these folks just typically not engaged in elections? Is that why the number is, I say as low, but relatively as low as they are compared to the partisan voters?
Yeah, well, this is a persistent thing. We've seen this election after election that unaffiliated voters turn out at lower rates than either Republicans or Democrats. Part of it is one, they do tend to be younger, and younger people tend to turn out at a lower rate than other people that are maybe more vested in the system. And also, folks that come in and registered unaffiliated, maybe a big portion of them do not have really strong feelings about one party or the other. And those strong feelings are what is going to motivate you to get out of bed and go vote. I mean, both parties are really pushing folks that they believe on their side to get out and vote. But that kind of internal motivation is more prevalent in people that have already said, well, I'm going to pick a side. I'm going to stick with my side. I'm going to vote for my side, than folks that, maybe don't feel quite as strongly about either party.
Andy, as we look at those unaffiliated voters, I assume there's also a bit of a messaging issue with them. If you're a Republican, how do you message an unaffiliated voter? If you're a Democrat, how do you message an unaffiliated voter? Is that also maybe some of the reason why these individuals, as you noted, aren't as likely to get out of bed and actually go out and vote?
Well, that's part of it. The issue is, when both parties have these kind of sophisticated systems for voter contact, where they look at your party affiliation, and that is an important thing. If somebody's registered Republican and you're a Republican, okay, this person is 95% likely to vote for my side if I can get her to the polls. Same thing for the Democrats. But for unaffiliated, they have to start looking at other things. If they look at, like, say, how was their past performance, like which parties did they vote for in primaries, for example. And if this person always voted in the Democratic primary, well, then she's probably a Democrat, so I probably want to work on her. They look at stuff like online or magazine subscriptions. If you're looking at Guns and Ammos, okay, maybe this person is a Republican, for example. And they bring all these things in there to try to build out their kind of propensity models on, is this person more likely to vote for our side than their side? And they'll target based on that. The part of the issue, once again, with unaffiliated voters being more likely to be younger, is they don't have that kind of history. If you're a Democrat, you can say, okay, maybe there's a 60 to 40% chance that if I'm going to target all these young unaffiliateds, that they'll vote my way. But that's less of a good odds than targeting other demographics. So, if you're a Democrat, you want to target Black voters, you're looking at 85, 90% propensity, for example, or other lists. So there's other priorities. And it's just, if folks don't have the internal motivation, it is harder to get that imposed upon them. I don't know if other people have seen these ads, but I've seen these ads where on YouTube or whatnot, where it comes up and they say, how you vote is private, but if you vote or not is public, and people, your grandmother will be able to look up and see if you voted. And so these groups are trying to basically shame unaffiliated voters and others into voting. And that's been shown to actually work. There's been studies that show that the shaming people and letting people know, hey, we are watching you when we know if you vote or not, can work. But it just takes so much more effort to get unaffiliated voting than registered partisans to vote. It takes a lot more effort. It takes a lot more money.
And it would take us all day to sit down and go through all of the data points and all the different counties across the state. John Locke has a product where folks can actually dig in and get that information. Where do they go to find those details?
The best way to do it is to look up at just Google Vote Tracker or Carolina elections, and that'll come up for them. And we have all the latest, and we update this every day. And so usually I come in, get my morning coffee, and by about 8:45 we have it. Specifically is carolinaelections.com, and then you'll see your options to look at either Vote Tracker or our voter registration update tool.
Andy Jackson joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Yeah, carolinaelections.com, a great website if you want to dig into some additional details. 545 and News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. Let's see what's going out on the roadways with Pam Warner.
All right, thanks.
1110 and 99.3.
WBT.
It's 5:52. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. Also streaming live this morning on our Carolina Journal YouTube channel. We continue to track legislation out of Raleigh. We've talked about the $644 million worth of disaster relief. That was passed yesterday by the General Assembly unanimously. That's Senate Bill 743 as the General Assembly was back in Raleigh dealing and continuing to deal with hurricane relief. There was also another piece of legislation, emergency legislation, that was passed yesterday, Senate Bill 132. That bill mandates additional early voting locations in two counties, McDowell and Henderson. This action comes after local election boards, which are controlled by Democrats, failed to open sufficient early voting locations despite public demand. And that's especially, of course, following the devastation from Hurricane Helene. The bill will require one early voting site per 30,000 registered voters in those two counties, compelling McDowell County to add at least one additional early voting location, and Henderson County, well, they're going to have to open 3 more sites for the final week of early voting. Henderson County has 120,000 registered voters and currently only has one early voting location in the entire county. After pressure, a second site was approved, but it would only have been open for 2 days. Comparatively, Buncombe County, which is where Asheville is, a Democrat stronghold, has more early voting sites open and better access for its population. Critics, including Republican Representative Jennifer Balcom, argued that the lack of sufficient early voting sites is suppressing voter turnout, particularly as additional sites in Henderson County were undamaged by the storm. The election board decided just not to open them. Efforts from groups like Restoration of America PAC aim to restore voting access in those disaster-affected areas, emphasizing the importance of nonpartisan solutions. Some Republicans have criticized the refusal to reopen or open at all some of those additional sites, stressing that this failure hampers turnout and creates additional challenges for voters that have likely already been impacted and affected by the hurricane. The emergency legislation seeks to address these issues, ensuring that voters in Western North Carolina can participate fully in the upcoming election, despite ongoing recovery efforts. And you've probably seen, if you spend any of your day browsing around Twitter or X, you've likely seen some of the pictures of mile-long lines at early voting locations, 2-3 hour waits in some locations. And so when this discussion translates into suppressing a voter turnout, whether they have the access or not to vote, to convince somebody to stand in a 2.5 hour line to vote is absolutely an issue. We'll continue to track that legislation, and we'll have all the details for you coming up early next week right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. The 4th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals is set to hear arguments in a lawsuit filed by Republican groups against the North Carolina State Board of Election. That's coming up on Monday. The lawsuit challenges the North Carolina State Board's voter registration process, specifically alleging that some 225,000 voters were registered without proper identification verification, which Republican groups claim could potentially allow non-citizens to register to vote. The federal district judge in Richard Myers dismissed part of the case and sent the remaining claims to state court, citing that state law issues, should be decided by state courts. Republican groups want the courts to ensure that voter eligibility is confirmed through HAVA. That's a federal program, while Democrats and their affiliated groups argue that the lawsuits are an attempt to undermine election integrity and could lead to disenfranchisement of voters. Both sides have filed briefs urging the appellate court to either uphold or reverse Myers' ruling. The lawsuit has become a focal point in the ongoing debate over election security and voter access in North Carolina ahead of the 2024 election cycle. Turning our attention back to hurricane relief this morning, a $644 million package, as we talked about. $604 million of that is coming from the state's rainy day fund. That fund was set up to do, well, exactly what it's doing, provide relief. And on a rainy day, unfortunately, that's what we saw out in western North Carolina. And $40 million from the Office of State Budget and Management Disaster Relief Reserve. That brings the state's total to over $800 million worth of relief thus far, far less than was demanded by Governor Roy Cooper earlier in the week. That piece of legislation has passed both the House and the Senate, and like the other bill, currently sits on Governor Roy Cooper's desk for either a signature or a veto. That's going to do it for a Friday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. WBT News is next, followed by Good Morning BT. We're back with the latest news Monday morning starting at 5 a.m. right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.